Burnout isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive with tears in the stairwell, or missed deadlines flagged in red, or dramatic exhaustion that sends you to bed by 7 o'clock each night. Sometimes burnout is quiet, so quiet you mistake it for competence. It shows up as distance, the strange sensation of watching yourself move through meetings, type emails, offer reassurance, while some essential part of you has stepped back to observe from the ceiling. As numbness, not emptiness, but a softening of edges, like colors fading from a photograph left in the sun. As doing everything you are asked to do, thoroughly, professionally, even gracefully, without feeling connected to any of it. You still show up, you still deliver. But the inner spark that once turned obligation into meaning has dimmed to an ember you can no longer feel warming your hands. That's the kind of burnout I didn't recognize at first, because it wore the same clothes as dedication, spoke with the same calm voice, left the same clean inbox at day's end, and that's what makes it so insidious. Burnout doesn't always announce itself as collapse. Sometimes it arrives as a slow subtraction of curiosity, of anticipation, of the quiet hum of purpose that once made Monday mornings feel like a beginning rather than a return to gravity. Somewhere along the way, there's no calendar date for this shift. Experience stops being an advantage and starts being treated like resistance. You notice it first in the tempo of conversations. Meetings that once moved at a pace you helped set now accelerate past you, filled with acronyms you haven't yet learned, references to tools adopted while you were heads down on Q3 deliverables. You raise a point grounded in 3 market cycles of precedent, and the room nods politely before pivoting to what's next. Not dismissively, never overtly, just forward. Ideas land differently depending on who carries them. You suggest a phased rollout based on lessons from the 2016 launch, met with thoughtful silence, then a gentle, "Let's stay agile." A colleague 10 years younger proposes the same caution wrapped in the language of testing assumptions, and it's welcomed as fresh perspective. You are still capable, still sharp, still contributing value that would be missed if withdrawn. But something has shifted beneath the surface. You are no longer seen as potential, someone to invest in, grow, promote. You are seen as maintenance, as stability, as the person who keeps the engine running while others design the new vehicle. And that change, it doesn't come with an announcement. No HR memo, no performance review that says your trajectory has plateaued. It arrives quietly in the guest list for the innovation workshop that somehow doesn't include you, in the way your suggestions are received as caution rather than wisdom, in the slow, almost imperceptible transfer of high-potential projects to younger hands, not because you can't handle them, but because the system has begun optimizing for its own future, not yours. You can feel it in every room after that, not as exclusion, but as a subtle shift in atmospheric pressure, like walking into a space where the temperature has dropped 2 degrees. No one else notices, but your body knows. The hardest part wasn't being tired. I had been tired before. Tired in the way that comes with deadlines and travel and responsibility. That kind of tired has an end point, a weekend, a vacation, a project close. This was different. The hardest part was realizing I was becoming invisible while still being needed. My work was still counted on, even expected. My presence still required at 9 each morning, the quarterly review, the client handoff. But my voice carried less weight. Not because I spoke less clearly, but because the room had begun listening for different frequencies. I remember one afternoon in a strategy session, I offered a perspective shaped by watching 3 similar initiatives rise and fall across 15 years. I laid out the pattern gently, not as a veto, but as context. The discussion continued as though I hadn't spoken. Not rudely, not intentionally, just onward. 5 minutes later, a vice president new to the company voiced nearly the same concern, framed as a question rather than a warning, and the room pivoted instantly. "That's a great point," someone said. "Let's pressure test that." In that moment, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel slighted. I felt a quiet, cold clarity. Decisions were being made elsewhere, in hallways I wasn't walking, in Slack threads I wasn't added to, in the unspoken consensus forming among people who saw the future without me in it. And that's when burnout changed shape. It wasn't exhaustion anymore. It was grief. Grief for a version of myself that once felt central, not in an egoic way, but in the quiet certainty that my presence mattered to the unfolding story. Grief for the slow realization that I had become optional, not to operations, but to imagination, to the dreaming of what comes next. That grief doesn't announce itself with sobs. It arrives as a hollowing, as the slow understanding that you have been building a home in a place that has already begun designing its next chapter without you. Corporate life doesn't tell you when you have reached the edge of your usefulness. It would be almost appearing as if being kind if it did so. Instead, it lets you sense it through 1,000 tiny signals that accumulate like sediment, through restructuring that streamlines your domain while expanding others, through silence where once there was consultation, the gradual disappearance of your name from precursors for decisions that will shape your teams next year, through the slow transfer of responsibility without the transfer of respect. You are still accountable for outcomes, but no longer invited into the rooms where those outcomes are defined. And one day, perhaps during a routine skip-level check-in, or while reading an org announcement over morning coffee, you understand. Not emotionally, not with drama, but clearly, quietly, irrevocably. No matter how much you've given, the late nights, the institutional memory, the steady hand during turbulence, the years of showing up when others left, the system will continue without you. Not because you weren't valuable, but because systems are designed to outlive their parts. That realization isn't cruel, it's simply true. And there's a strange liberation in accepting it, not as indictment, but as physics. A wise man once told me that a river doesn't mourn the stone it has smoothed and carried downstream. The river just simply flows, and the stone, once released, is finally still. This isn't about being discarded. It's about recognizing that loyalty to a system is always asymmetrical. You may give your best years to its continuity, but its continuity was never dependent on you. Only your sense of belonging was. And in that recognition lies the beginning of a different question. Not, how can I be more valued here? But what do I value, and where will I invest it now? Burnout taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. Not in a workshop, not from a mentor, not from any well-intentioned article about work-life balance. It taught me that my worth was never tied to my stamina, that the ability to endure, to absorb pressure, to stay functional through season after demanding season is not the same as thriving. It is survival wearing a professional face. It taught me that being needed is not the same as being valued, that indispensability in operations can coexist with invisibility and influence, and that confusing the two is how good people slowly disappear while still occupying their desks. Most of all, it taught me this. Staying functional long after something has stopped nourishing you is not resilience. Resilience is the capacity to bend without breaking, and then to return to your original shape. What I had mistaken for resilience was something even more quiet. The slow erosion of self in service of a structure that cannot reciprocate. But burnout, in its strange mercy, becomes a teacher. It strips away the illusion that your value is contingent on your utility. It forces a reckoning, not with failure, but with truth. And the truth is this: you were never meant to pour your entire existence into a container not designed to hold it. Your life was always larger than your role. Your purpose always wider than your responsibilities. Your worth always deeper than your output. Burnout doesn't have to be an ending. Sometimes it's the quiet collapse of a false foundation, the necessary crumbling that makes space for something genuine to grow. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but in the slow return of feeling. The first morning you wake and notice the light through the blinds again. The first project you decline not out of exhaustion, but out of clarity. The first boundary you set, not as rebellion, but as homecoming. That's when you realize that burnout wasn't the loss of yourself. It was the long, quiet prelude to finding yourself again, not as a resource to be managed, but as a life to be lived. This is another thread in the quiet tapestry of 42 years of work, not offered as advice, not wrapped in regret, not as a mistake I needed to undo, just shared as something that became clear once I stopped filling every silence and learned to listen to what remained.